Hi, this is Tamara at mooglyblog.com, and in this video, I'm going to be demonstrating how to crochet the Cupcake tee, which is a free pattern you'll find on mooglyblog.com. Please go to the link in the description where you will find a link out to the written pattern, both right and left-handed video tutorials, and links to all the supplies you need, as well as the other video tutorials that I may mention here today. You'll also want to make sure to go to the written pattern, which, as I said, is linked at the link in the description, because this pattern comes in a whopping 9 sizes. Extra small, small, medium, large, extra large, 2X, 3X, 4X, and 5X. These are all based on the Craft Yarn Council standards with about 4 inches of positive ease in the chest. So if you like your garments a little tighter, you can move down a size. If you like them a little looser, you can move up a size. It's up to you. A schematic is also given on the written pattern, which I've got right here. You can see here my little printout, and this shows the back, which is a simple rectangle, and the front, which begins, we work bottom up, begins as the same rectangle, and then spreads out right here as we work up towards the neckline. And if we look at our finished top here, that creates this great cowl neckline, sort of drapes down in front. It's really flattering. Other than that, it's very simple because you're just seaming up the sides and at the shoulders when you work these two pieces. Now, obviously, the different sizes have different measurements, and all of those are included on the schematic as well, with a little key down here because that was just too many numbers and they would be too small if I'd tried to put them right on the schematic. But you can use this key with the letters to see exactly what each of those measurements should be. Now, this is a very stretchy fabric, so if you don't get these exact same measurements, that's fine. Additionally, I want to mention that these measurements, as well as the gauge listed on the pattern, are for an unblocked laid flat garment. As I said, this is very stretchy. When you put it on, it will drape and pull down, so it will wear a bit longer than it does lay on the table. So do keep that in mind. Feel free to try it on as you go. Make the back first so you can hold it up to yourself, and you can just pull back a couple rows or add a couple rows if you need them for your own personal length. It's a really simple pattern. So to make the Cupcake tee, you're going to need Red Heart It's a Wrap sprinkles, or you can use Red Heart It's a Wrap rainbow. I used Red Heart It's a Wrap sprinkles to make this one, which creates this sort of variegated look. You can see right here, I've got a cake of it, and it's got a lot of variation in here. I've got another example of Red Heart It's a Wrap sprinkles here. You can see it also would have sort of that sprinkly look, but it would create a very different look. Especially starting in the middle here, you'd have a lighter color on the bottom and a darker color, moving to an even lighter color here at the top. So those are a couple options, but I do want to point out you can also use Red Heart It's a Wrap rainbow. This is a great substitute if you don't want the variegated look, but you still maybe want that ombre. There are a lot of really gorgeous colorways in It's a Wrap rainbow as well. So feel free to use either of these yarns to make this pattern. If you're making the sizes extra small through 3X, you'll need 2 cakes of It's a Wrap sprinkles. And if you are making, or It's a Wrap rainbow for that matter, they are the same size. I was just kind of checking that here. If you're making the 4X or 5X, you will need 3 cakes. So let's go. Oh, and I should mention too, besides the yarn, of course, you will need a hook. This one is by Clover. It's a G, 4mm. And then, of course, your standard tools, scissors, yarn needle, and stitch markers. Now let's go ahead and get started demonstrating this Cupcake tee. All right, now if you look at the written instructions for the Cupcake tee, you'll see there are several notes listed before the actual instructions begin. You need to start with a new cake for each half of the top. There is some color variation. It's a little, well, depending on the cake you use, it'll be a different color on the inside than it is from the outside. So in order to get this effect on both the front and the back, you'll want to start each piece with a new cake. I also want to point out that Red Heart It's a Wrap sprinkles has a really easy center pull. So look for the string that's usually sort of tucked into the outside of the label here. Now, before you begin the back, depending on the size you're making. With the larger sizes, you may not want to do this because you've got that third cake to pull from. But for the smaller sizes, you may want to pull out a small portion of the center before you begin. Just really carefully pull out a little chunk, cut it, set it aside, and then you can use that when you make the bottom hem so that you have some matching yarn. But that's completely optional. So let's go ahead and begin with our instructions for the back, row 1. Now, depending on the size you make, you will be chaining anywhere from 91 to 175 stitches. So this is a case where, again, you definitely need the written pattern. There's too many numbers for me here to list. I think if I tried to do this verbally, it would just get really confusing for everybody. So do go to the written pattern. You can print it out using Print Friendly or Clean Print or copy and paste to a Word doc, whatever works for you. So you can circle or highlight the numbers for your size. So you make sure you follow those throughout the pattern. But otherwise, it just starts very simply. We start with a long chain of however many needed for your pattern. And right there, I want to show you, this is the risk with this yarn. You need to pay attention because it's very easy to pull these little strings apart. So if that happens, though, it also frogs really beautifully. So you just pull that out and try again. But you'll need to pay attention and make sure you're snagging each of those strings each time. Now, if you find that you've worked a few rows with this yarn and you missed a string in the previous row, when you come back and work into that stitch, just try and pull it up and enclose it in the stitch. Don't worry about frogging back for every little bit. You can usually sort of work those back into the pattern. At least that's what I do. I suppose if I were entering it into some sort of contest, I might, go back and make it perfect. But when I'm crocheting for me, I just make it good. So let's see. I don't know how many exactly I've got chained here, but I think it's enough for us to demonstrate the pattern. What you want to do, as I said, is chain the number listed for your size. Then to begin, we're going to double crochet in the 4th chain from the hook. So that means we skip the 3 chains closest to the hook. This never includes the chain or the loop that's on the hook itself. So we count 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to double crochet in the 4th one. I like to work into the back hump of the chain. I think it gives me an easier edge to work into when I come back for my hemline, but it is completely up to you. So I'm just going to go under that loop there. If you prefer, you can go under the top 2, whatever you like, and just carefully make my double crochet. There we are. Now the 3 chains that I skipped there, when I skipped over them to double crochet in the 4th, those are going to count as the first double crochet for this row. So what I like to do here, just so that I remember and make sure I work into every stitch, I'm going to take a stitch marker and put it right in the top of that 3rd chain, right there, the one right at the top, because that will count as the top of that double crochet. And that way I can make sure when I come back from the other direction that I do work into that stitch. So then I'm just going to continue double crocheting across in each chain. So at the end of row 1, you should just have a row of solid double crochet, pretty straightforward. If you like to use the foundation double crochet stitch instead of chaining and working into the chain, you can absolutely do that too. Either way, just make sure you take your time, get all those loops, and work across until you have the number of double crochets indicated for your size. Then we'll be ready to begin row 2. So I'm just going to keep double crocheting across here, and I'll see you when we're ready for the next row. All right, so at the end of row 1, you'll have anywhere from 89 to 173 double crochets. To begin row 2, we are going to turn and chain, or chain and turn, whichever you prefer, but we want to start with a chain of 4. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now those 4 chains are going to count as a double crochet and a chain 1. So again, I want to use a stitch marker to help me mark the top of my double crochet. So I'm not going to put it into this chain here, that's our chain 1. I want to put it into the chain right underneath. So again, sort of the top of a chain 3, if you will. There we are. And then I will know this is our last double crochet when I come back for row 3. Now, a note about this, if you prefer, and personally I do, it's a little bit more difficult, you can use a chainless starting double crochet to make this double crochet and then chain 1, and indeed to make the double crochet at the beginning of, any of the rest of the rows. It's completely up to you. There's a separate tutorial for it. It is a more advanced stitch. So if you want to go, again, to the link in the description, there is a tutorial for that as an option, specifically listed in the notes. So that is up to you. Otherwise, I'm just going to show sort of the basic version here today. So after we've made our chain 4, which counts as a double crochet, and a chain 1, we're going to skip the next stitch. Now that first stitch is already considered worked into because that chain 3 counted as a double crochet. So we want to skip the next stitch and then double crochet in the stitch after that. So I've already yarned over. I just go into the top of that stitch, put my loop, and make my double crochet. And then that is basically our repeat across. Chain 1, skip the next stitch, double crochet in the next. So we're just going to continue just like that all the way across for row 2. So chain 1, skip 1, double crochet in the one after that. And that just creates that really stable and very modern and clean looking mesh here, like so. So continue doing that on across. Of course, you'll have a lot more stitches than I do, and I'll see you when we're ready for row 3. All right, so we've finished row 2 of the back of our cupcake tee. We've just got this really simple mesh worked across. Now, rows 3 through 5 are going to be just like row 2, except instead of working into a solid row, of course, we're going to be working into a mesh row. So it's just that little bit different. So once again, though, we're going to start with a chain 4. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that's a double crochet and a chain 1. So you can go ahead and get your stitch marker here in that chain 3 now. There, that third chain, the third of the 4. There we are. Then I can turn to come back the other direction. There we are. And now instead of skipping a stitch, I'm just going to skip over that chain 1 space and work right into each double crochet. So I double crochet in the double crochet, chain 1, skip that chain 1 space, and double crochet in the next. Like so. So we're just building those, oops, split my yarn there. So we're just building little crochet blocks of mesh, if you will, right on top of each other. One right on top of the other. And yes, this yarn, it's fiddly. It's a little delicate. When your piece is bigger, obviously, than this tiny little swatch, it's a little more stable and easy to work into. But these first few rows do take some time and care. There we are. Once you've got the pattern well established, it really does zip along pretty well because you're pretty much just chaining and double crocheting. And yeah, that's about it for the whole pattern, as you'll soon see. So you can see I've already worked all the way across here for my row 3. I want to make sure to work into that top of that chain. That's my top of my double crochet there that I marked with my stitch marker. Of course, then I can pull that stitch marker right on out. But obviously you'll have a lot more of these. Yours is going to be a lot wider unless you too are making a little Barbie size here. So you just have worked across, working into those double crochets with chain 1s in between. That's row 3. Rows 4 and 5 are exactly the same. Let me pull up the finished one again so you can get an idea here. All right, so here we have the first row of our cupcake tee, and then row 2, of course, we worked the mesh right in there. And as you can see, rows 3, 4, and 5 are exactly the same. Then we start our repeat over again here with row 6. Row 6 is going to be another solid row. So it's just like row 1, it's all double crochets, but instead of working to the chains, we work into each stitch and each chain space. So let me demonstrate that for you now. All right, so I've got my little swatch back up here, and even though I've only worked 3 rows, like I said, rows 4 and 5 are exactly the same, so we're just going to move on to row 6. Row 6 begins with a chain 3, and again, this will count as our first double crochet. So if you like, you can go ahead and grab that stitch marker and put it right in the top there of that third chain, like so. I really find this makes it a lot easier for me. So if you find it easier, absolutely go ahead and make it easier for you. Then, as I said, this counts as our first double crochet, so we don't want to work into that stitch. We just come right to this chain 1 space, and I like to work right into the space, not into the chain itself. Again, if you prefer to work into the chain itself, you could, but I like to work into the chain space. It's just a lot quicker and easier than trying to work into each fiddly little chain. Then we double crochet in the next stitch, and then the next chain space, and then the next stitch, and we just keep working all the way across. In each chain space, we work one double crochet, and then in each double crochet, we work one double crochet. So this is how we make our solid rows. And this is going to be our repeat for the rest of the back. For rows 7 through however many repeats you need to do for your size, you're going to repeat rows 2 through 6. Remember, 2 was our first mesh row. 3, 4, and 5 were those other mesh rows worked into the mesh row, and then 6 is the solid row. So we're just going to basically keep making 4 rows of mesh in between each row of solid crochet and end on a row of solid double crochet. So no mesh on that last row. So if you're making the extra small, you would be working for 51 rows, and if you're making the 5X, you'll be working for 66 rows. Just make sure, oops, as you get down to the end here, we want to make sure to put one in this chain 1 space. Don't miss that one. It's easy with the chain 4 hanging out there on the end. And then, of course, one right in the top of that turning chain, or our chain 3 double crochet, I should say. There we go. So that is essentially row 6. So we just keep making those until we've got our back finished. It's just one big rectangle. Then we're ready to begin the front portion. And the front portion of the cupcake tee begins with the front waist. And the front waist rows 1 through 15 to 30, depending on the size you're making, are exactly the same as the back. The same stitch count, the same rows, the exact same pattern. We just don't do it for quite as many rows because then we move on to the front chest. So again, you'll need to check your written instructions to see how many rows of the front waist you make, again, exactly identical to the back, before you begin the front chest portion. When it's time to begin the front chest portion, what I want you to do is on that last row that you made for the front waist, which is going to be a row 5 rep, which will be, so it'll be a mesh row. When you get to that row, I want you to put a stitch marker right in the side of it so you can start your row count over again for the front chest. So let me go ahead and get this swatch ready, and let's start demonstrating those stitches involved in the front chest portion. All right, so as I just mentioned, when you're working the front waist, you'll end on a row 5 repeat. So that's going to be mesh. Now, row 5, of course, will have 4 rows of mesh here, but again, we're just working with our tiny swatch. So after you've made your row 5 repeat, go ahead, like I said, and put a stitch marker right in the side of that row. That way you can move on to the front chest portion and know that this was the last row of the waist, so you restart your stitch counts, or your row counts, I should say. Now, for the front chest, for all sizes, it involves 36 rows. That gives us the wide portion that when we bring it in, creates that cowl neckline. If you do not want your cowl neckline to be as deep as you've seen in the photos and as you can see in the schematic, then you can work more rows of the back waist before you begin the increases on the front chest. You just want to make sure that at the end you've worked the exact same number of rows as you've worked for your back. So let's go ahead and begin the front chest portion. Row 1 begins with chain 3. Very familiar, right? 2, 3, and that's going to count as our first double crochet. So we can use another stitch marker right in the top there if we like. I always like to. I'm not a big fan of working into chains when I don't have to, so I can always use that stitch marker to sort of pull that stitch open for me. So let me pull that loop back down here and turn our little swatch. And then I am going to double crochet again in that first stitch. And I say again because remember that chain 3 counts as our first double crochet. Normally we wouldn't work into this stitch, but we want to increase here. So I'm going to put another double crochet, if you will, right into that first stitch. So at this point, we have 2 double crochets in that first stitch. After that, we're just going to work this the same way we worked our other solid rows until we get to the very last stitch of the row. So we just double crochet in each chain space, and then in each stitch, and each chain space on across until we get to the last stitch of this row. So I will see you when we get to the end of row 1 of our front chest. All right, so here I am at the end of row 1 of our front chest, and I've got that top of that chain 3 marked. I have double crocheted in that chain 1 space. Remember, it was actually a chain 4. So we want to double crochet in that chain 1 space, so to speak, and then in the top of the chain 3, or your chainless starting double crochet, if that's what you've used, we want to work 2 double crochets. So this mirrors what we did at the beginning. We had 2 double crochets in the first stitch. We just want to have 2 double crochets in the last stitch. So after we've made that last one there, go ahead and remove that stitch marker. We don't want to remove the one that's in the side of the previous row because that's, remember, helping us maintain our row count here. So after that, we're ready to begin row 2 of the front chest. We're going to start with a chain 4, again, pretty familiar, 2, 3, 4, and those will, of course, count as a double crochet and chain 1. So we can pick up our next stitch marker here and get that right in the top of the chain 3. And then turn to come back the other direction. But we want to increase in this row as well. So to do this, rather than skipping over this stitch in this stitch, we're going to double crochet in the very next stitch. So not this one right here, but the very next one. And how is this an increase? Well, remember before, we would have skipped that one when we had our chain 1. So if you think about it, in this first stitch, we've now got 2 stitches again. We've got a double crochet and a chain 1. So we're still just increasing right at the end there. After that, it's our standard mesh rows until we get to the end again. So we chain 1, skip 1, and double crochet in the next. Chain 1, skip 1, double crochet in the next. And the way you can check to make sure that you are increasing on your ends correctly here in these mesh rows is that these should still line up. You see, this double crochet is directly above this double crochet. We're maintaining our stitch pattern here. If you end up working in between the ones below, if they become offset, then you know you've got some trouble on your ends. And so you'll need to go back and look at that and check where those are. So that's just a really good visual cue or clue, if you will, to help you make sure that you are maintaining the stitch pattern correctly. So just do your mesh, like I said, on across. We're almost there. Of course, you'll have a lot more of these than I will. But I want to point out when you get to the end of this row, you chain one, skip one, double crochet in the next. After you do that, here at the very end, you'll have one more double crochet. You can see here hanging out at the side. Remember, this is actually the top of our chain 3. So here we're going to chain 1 and then just double crochet in that last stitch, because that chain 1 is our increase, so to speak, for this one. There we are. Work that on up. There we are. And that is the end of row 2. So I'll go ahead and pull that stitch marker out so it's ready to help me begin row 3. Row 3 is, of course, another increase row. We're going to keep increasing essentially by 2 stitches until we get to the end of the front chest. So for row 3, we'll start with chain 3. 1, 2, 3. Of course, that counts as our first double crochet. So if you'd like, you can stick your stitch marker right in there. And then we are going to double crochet in the first stitch again. So right in that very first stitch, the same way we started the solid rows. However, we are going to do a mesh row again, because remember, we want 4 rows of mesh in between each row of solid. So after we've made our second double crochet in that first stitch, we chain 1, skip the chain 1 space, and double crochet in the next double crochet. So this really helps us maintain that mesh again. Chain 1, skip the chain 1 space, double crochet in the next double crochet. And that keeps our stitches all nicely lined up. But again, we've increased 1 stitch on the end. And then, of course, we'll want to do it again on the other end when we get to the last end of this row. So the beginning and the end. I guess that's a little clearer, right? We're almost there. Whoops. Watch those little strings. There we are. Like I say, I know this yarn's a little fiddly, but man, the drape and the color, it's just so nice. And the feel is fantastic too. I really love this yarn for warmer weather. So here we are. I've been chain 1, skipping the chain 1 space and working my way across. So when I get to the end of this row, I've got a chain 1 space, and then I've marked the top of my chain 3 there. So I'll work right into there. It wants to be fiddly on me. There we are. Get that stitch in there. And then, so that it mirrors, remember what we did at the beginning, we want to make a second double crochet right in that last stitch. So that is the basics for row 3. Row 4 is going to be exactly the same as row 2, except this time we're working back into mesh. So how do we do that? We pull that stitch marker out of the way. We start with a chain 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. We mark that third chain up there. There we are. And then, of course, that is our double crochet and chain 1. So we don't work back in that first stitch this time. We work into the second stitch, the second of that pair. Worked right into the end there. So that's our double crochet there. And then we work our mesh on across. Chain 1, skip the chain 1 space, double crochet in the next double crochet. So you can see the way we handle the ends there differently depending on the row. Rows 3 versus 4 is essentially just a matter of lining them upright so that they maintain the mesh pattern here in the middle. So you just work your way on right across here until we get to the end. Whoops. Like so. And then we're almost there. Of course, it's taking a little bit longer because we are getting wider. Like I said, each one of these rows 1 through 36 of the front chest, you'll increase by 2 stitches, and that's including the chains, obviously, in that count. So when you get to the end here, we've got our double crochet here in this stitch, the second to last stitch. And then to finish off row 4, we just chain 1 and double crochet in that very last stitch. Like so. We didn't have a chain 1 to skip over there. Oops, I went around it instead of in it. Working into those chains does just take a little bit of time. There we go. Got my stitch in there. All right. So that finishes up row 4. Like so. And if I hold it up, you can see we've got our increases going, and that's really already creating that really wide neckline. So I'll pull this stitch on out, and I'm going to demonstrate just a couple more rows for you here. Row 3 is exactly the same, or excuse me, row 5 is exactly the same as row 3. So just what we did for row 3, you want to go back and do that again. Same thing, we're going to chain 3, 1, 2, 3, double crochet right back in that same first stitch. And that sets us up to chain 1, skip the chain 1 space, and double crochet in the next double crochet, and maintain our great mesh look. Like so. So row 5, like I said, is exactly the same as row 3. Then row 6, same thing as row 1, back here. Remember where we did two double crochets in the first stitch, and then double crochet our way across, 2 double crochets in the last stitch. Now, the repeat for the front chest looks long. It's a repeat of rows 2 through 11, but the thing is, they're all basically the same as what I just showed you. The only difference is you have to work the rows 3 and 4 repeats in a slightly different order after you make each solid row, because the solid row takes a space, those get offset. So basically, we worked row 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a repeat of row 3, and then it'll be a repeat of row 1, and then we have to go to rows 4, 3, 4, 3 for the repeats. I know that sounds a little complicated, but again, I've already demonstrated all these rows, so this is where you need the written pattern. It's really helpful to mark off each of these rows as you make them on the written pattern to make sure you're making each one. And if you do get lost, again, you can just look at your mesh, make sure they're all lining up, and that you're getting 4 rows of mesh in between each row of solid crochet, and that will really help you stay on track. Eventually, when you get to the end of row 36, it's going to be a row, it would be a row 1 repeat essentially. So you'd be working one final row of solid double crochet. At the end of that row, you should have anywhere from 161 to 245 stitches in row 36. After you've finished that up, it's time for assembly. So I'm going to finish up this little swatch right here so I can show you how this top comes together. All right, so when you have finished making the back and front of your cupcake sweater, they'll hopefully be a lot bigger than this, but this will help us demonstrate the basic assembly. Now, if we bring up our schematic on our written pattern here, there are little lines here, D and C on either side here, show where you're going to be sewing the pieces together. Basically, C, the shoulder seams, are measured from the outside in, so from both edges. So for example, the small size, you're going to be seaming up 5.5 inches on the shoulders. You want to measure that from this edge in, and then from this edge in on the back, and then from this edge in on the front, and this edge in on the front. That sounds really complicated, but it's really not that difficult. What we want to do is take our back piece and our front piece here, and I want to make sure that the wrong sides are together. Now, the wrong side, right side is really up to you. You just want to make sure that when you're wearing it, those stitches are heading the same direction. So we can flip over the back and lay our top right on top here. Again, they should be the same length, or the same height, I guess. And then the width should be the same here at the bottom, those first few rows, and then the top just gets wider while the back, of course, stays straight. So when you measure out and seam up your shoulders, you're going to be finding that outside edge of the top and that outside edge of the back, or that outside edge of the front and the outside edge of the back, top. All these words apply. And then you can go ahead and just match up that first stitch with your stitch marker there. And then you can measure out, just don't stretch it when you're measuring. Measure out 5.5 inches or however many inches for your size. For example, for the 5X, it's going to be 11.5 inches. Measure that out on one side, gently. Go ahead, mark it wherever that is. Do the same thing on the back, and then start matching up your stitches, and just make sure that you've got, this stitch with this stitch, this stitch, this stitch, so that when you sew them together, you are pairing those up perfectly, and you're not, working too many stitches into the back or the front. Because you're working into a finished row, this should be relatively simple to really just match up those stitches, measure them again, always measure twice, cut once, so to speak, although no cutting. And and then you can use your yarn to seam up those shoulder seams however you like. I used the whip stitch, which is a very, very simple stitch, and I do have a separate tutorial for that linked at the link in the description. However, you could use the mattress stitch or use a crochet stitch to seam it up however you like. This part is totally up to you. Now, by measuring in from both of those edges, of course, we will be having a much narrower neckline here in the back, which is E, than in the front. That front or F measurement is what drapes down and creates that cowl. So after we have seamed up our shoulders, then we can move on to seaming up the sides. Or you could do the sides first and then the shoulders. It's totally up to you. Now for the sides, let me come back over to our little swatch here. Obviously, you're going to be working from the bottom up. I liked to leave a little 2-inch sort of kick flap. Let me pull up the finished one here to show that to you real quick. All right, and here you can see it. So this is my bottom edge. So I just didn't seam up those bottom 2 inches. This is optional, although that's how I've written it out. If you wanted to, you can seam all the way to the bottom. After that though, I measured up according to the schematic. Again, different measurements for different sizes on up the side and just seamed those two sides together. Now I want to point out that there were increases happening as I seamed those up on the top portion. That's okay. Just keep those edges together. It's going to obviously tilt in at the front. Again, that's what creates the collar. So we just keep seaming right on up to that measurement or wherever you like it. Don't tie off those ends until you're sure. Try it on with the ends of the seam still loose, and then you can adjust it as you go. So after you've seamed up those sides, again, I just want to point out on the schematic, you will find the exact measurements under D for those right there, and you've adjusted them to where you like them. Remember, that's just here. All this will be left open for the armholes. E and F will be left open for the neck, and of course A at the bottom hem, you need some place for your waist. So after you've done your seaming, then you're just going to work a simple single crochet edging along the edges that are left sort of open here. So I just worked some single crochets right around the bottom and up the sides of my little kick pleat, so to speak, although it's more on the hips. It's not really a kick pleat. It's not down by the feet. Maybe a hip gusset. I don't know. Whatever the words are, there's probably something official. But anyway, so I just single crocheted right along the bottom, single crocheted right all the way around the neck opening, just to finish it off and give it a nice little edge there. All right, so after you have worked your single crochet edgings around the bottom hem and the neckline, then of course you can do the sleeves as well. And that just finishes this off really nicely. If you wanted longer sleeves, this is sort of more of a cap sleeve. It sort of hangs right over the shoulder. Then you could add a few more rows here of crochet if you wanted to lengthen the sleeves out. Otherwise, we can see here, we've got our back opening, our longer front opening to create our cowl neckline, and we have made our cupcake tee. Here are a few more shots of the finished garment on me. And that's how you crochet the cupcake tee. I hope you'll give this pattern a try. I hope you'll give Red Heart It's a Wrap Sprinkles a try. It's a really great yarn, especially for summer with this great cotton acrylic blend. If this video has helped you, please give it a like. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you do have any other questions, let me know. I always try to answer them. And don't forget to subscribe to the Moogly Blog YouTube channel for more great tutorials, lives, and other crochet fun. Thanks so much for watching.